Hello, everyone. Today it's my pleasure to be speaking with Malcolm Gaskill. Malcolm Gaskill is Emeritus Professor of Early Modern History at the University of East Anglia and is one of Britain's leading experts on the history of witchcraft. His works include the highly acclaimed Witchfinders, a 17th century English tragedy, and Between Two Worlds, How the English Became Americans. And more recently, a fantastic book which I've been reading called The Ruin of All Witches, Life and Death in the New World, which has received quite a significant amount of acclaim so far. Isn't that right, Malcolm? I read it that it's a Sunday Times bestseller. It's been shortlisted for the Wolfson History Prize, a Times, Sunday Times and BBC History Book of the Year. It's had plaudits from Hilary Mantel, Sunday Times and BBC History. So it's doing pretty well, eh?
It's been very gratifying. Yeah, thanks, Tom. It's quite a surprise, really. I mean, because you spend an awful lot of time writing a book on your own, and by the end of it, you're not sure whether it's of any interest at all or if it's any good or anything. So actually, to kind of to fledge it out in the world and then find that people are actually reading it and liking it and buying it, that this is actually tremendously rewarding part of the whole process. So yeah, it's done better than any other book that I've ever written before. So in some ways, I feel like I've been waiting 20 years for this moment.
Superb. And all of that hard work has certainly paid off, because you're drawing on a very deep well of knowledge in having written the book and going about that process. I have to say at the top of the call, because you and I were talking just before we hit record about our previous acquaintance to some extent, and how we knew each other previously in a different context. We were talking about digital archives at the time, things like the State Papers Online and other archives, Cornell witchcraft collections and things like that. And I ran into your book in Waterstones in Harrogate in North Yorkshire, and that's what piqued my interest. I thought, oh, hang on a minute, I know Malcolm, and so picked up the book and gave it a read. And that was great. It was great to be reminded of your work and also to see that. Just in starting things off, Malcolm, what I'm interested to ask and to get into it to start with is looking at witches, because witches is something that is an area of your focus in your research, and it was certainly in your teaching as well. So what was a witch? It sounds like a fairly banal question, but what was a witch, particularly in the period that you cover, which I understand to be the mid-16th to the mid-17th centuries?
Yeah, it's pretty much my period, and that's the period in which this phenomenon known as the witch hunt or the great witch craze takes place. It's not a particularly medieval thing. It's pretty much over by the end of the 18th century across Europe, and really by the end of the 17th century, it's pretty much over in England and in America. I think the question of what a witch is, I don't think it's a banal question at all. I think it's an absolutely fundamental one, because we're not entirely sure, because we feel it's, for most of it, is passed out of our experience. And actually, people in the 17th century didn't really know either. So there were lots of different meanings to witch, lots of different facets to this as an idea. And so that everybody could kind of agree that there was a stereotype witch of the malevolent old woman, and everybody agreed that if witches did exist, that they were human beings who made some kind of arrangement with the devil and drew power from the devil. But how you actually translated that to real life, how you actually could identify a specific person as a witch, and even more importantly, accuse them at law and have them convicted, that was a much harder thing to do. And so actually the law has an idea about what a witch is. The clergy have an idea, Protestant clergy particularly have an idea of what a witch is. And then there's the neighbourhood witch as well. So it's actually a very difficult question to answer simply, and that really these aren't just choices of definition. They're in tension with each other, and that a witch can mean a different thing depending on the context. But again, that's not just a historical difference of opinion. That's something that was very live at the time, that nobody really could, in the end, actually decide definitively what a witch was.
Yeah, very interesting, because you talked there about what other people thought a witch was, rather than somebody defining themselves as a witch. So it's what do the Protestants think a witch is versus what the law thinks a witch is, etc. And so I just wonder, have you come across much in terms of the research that you've done of people who've identified themselves as witches, and from their point of view, would they have said that there are different types of witches? Would you say, you know, we've heard this phrase before in popular culture of white witches, as opposed to, I suppose, I don't know what the alternative would be, dark black witches, dark spirits, that sort of idea. Is that something that you've come across in your own research?
Well, of course, some people do confess to witchcraft. And I think from the modern perspective, we often assume that if you confess to witchcraft, you must have been mad or you must have been tortured. And that, well, you know, that is undoubtedly the case in some instances. But there is the possibility for people to believe that they have this power themselves. They may have actually tried to get hold of the power. They may have you know, felt that they were successful in forming a pact with the devil. They may have felt that they formed a pact with the devil in their own hearts, even if they didn't actually meet this dark creature called the devil and create some kind of gross physical pact with him. I think that the witchcraft as a power was something that could be real in the minds of people who would confess that they were witches. There were, as you say, white witches. They didn't call themselves witches, but the church particularly said, well, if you're using any kind of magical power, or if you're using any kind of traditional prayer that isn't Orthodox Protestant prayer, then you might not realize it, but you are actually a witch, because you're over the you know, you've crossed the line from the acceptable into the unacceptable. And in a very polarized kind of ideology, you know, good and evil, Protestant and Catholic, light and dark, witch and good neighbor could, you know, could be arranged in that way, and you could be the wrong side of that line. So the witch is something that somebody could claim for themselves, although that would have been it's a very self-damning thing to do, given that witchcraft is a crime. But more often, witchcraft is an identity that fearful people project onto others, and it's much more about accusing someone of being a witch rather than somebody laying claim to it themselves.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It seems like it's a term that's been weaponized by people in power who've defined certain things in a certain way, and it isn't just, like you say, it isn't just Christian or non-Christian. It's about Protestantism and this particular way of worshiping God and being a Christian, right? And everything outside of that is unorthodox. It's something that is to be frowned upon, and we're going to basically stigmatize it, and we're going to cast it out however we can. So it's quite interesting, like you say as well, somebody self-defining as that, as a witch, would be putting themselves at risk as well. So it's probably difficult in that respect to get too much out of that in the primary sources, because of the inherent risks of doing so. What you say about witchcraft as being an alternative power source is interesting. I wonder, do you have much that you've come across in the historical primary sources along the lines of witchcraft being an alternative power source that people have drawn?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Which everybody in the 17th century would understand the concept of witchcraft being power for the powerless. So that, and this I think helps us to understand the kind of dark fantasy that there may be witches living next door to you, or witches in the neighborhood who have got it in for you. Because, you know, witchcraft, like any crime, needs a motive. What would that motive be? Envy, jealousy, spite, resentment. And that, you know, this is really what the imaginary witch is. When I say the imaginary witch, I mean the idea of witchcraft, which then becomes transferred to a specific person. It has to be that someone has no natural power, and therefore that they are drawing on some kind of supernatural power in order to have it in for you. Now, you mentioned just then, you know, about the idea about witchcraft being weaponized as an idea by people in power, but that really, I mean, that's not untrue. But the way that most witchcraft accusations happen is not by people in power. It's about people who are perhaps, you know, a little bit better off or have a little bit more authority. But actually, witchcraft is a crime which arises from similarity between accuser and accused as much as it arises from dissimilarity. Because actually, if somebody is much more powerful than you, then they just use natural power in order to get the better of you. But when people are neighbors and they're locked in this relationship where they're actually very similar, that's when I think you get some of the most troubled feelings, and where the idea comes from that somebody, you can't get one over on somebody else by natural means, therefore it must be so supernatural means. So witches are not all, they are sometimes dependents in the community, but often they are just people who are quite active in the community and are locked in conflict with others, but that conflict cannot be resolved by any other means. And so this is what happens in the Ruin of All Witches, that these are people, the accusers and the accused are very, very similar. They are not, their similarities far outweigh their differences. And that's because they are neighbours in the way that I've described, but that the married couple, Hugh and Mary Parsons, at the heart of the story, fall foul of the expectations, the culture, I suppose, of their neighbours. And that's what marks them out as different. But that it's really their similarity and the fact that many of the things that they are accused of, many of their kind of negative neighbourly qualities, or the lack of neighbourly qualities, many of those things that their accusers are guilty of themselves. So there's this sort of transference of a kind of guilt or an unbearable burden of, feelings of self-failure, which are then projected onto these people. But that only really works if these people are actually already quite like you.
Yeah, that's quite a good point, especially about the power dynamics, because if somebody was that much more powerful, and they have the means at their disposal to tackle you anyway. So that's interesting, and it brings us on to talking about Springfield, the place in which the Ruin of All Witches is set. So tell us a little bit about that, because I'm interested in what you say there about the peer-to-peer relations between those who are accused of witchcraft and the accusers themselves. So how was society structured in Springfield, and how was power set up in that particular society?
Well, Springfield is peculiar even amongst colonial plantations. So this is a Massachusetts frontier township in the middle of the 17th century, and it's been founded 15 years earlier by a man called William Pynchon, who's a migrant from England. And he is kind of the center of all power in this place. So in some ways, he resembles a sort of an old world lord of the manor. He's in charge of everything. And he makes this town possible. So anybody that goes and moves there and lives there is in his debt, literally in his debt, because he provides them with all the things that they need to build a life there. So it means that if you've come from old England, which is overcrowded, there are few opportunities to work, there's no land, going to Springfield, Massachusetts is amazing because it's got everything, but it comes at a price. So that there is tension between neighbours because there's competition for resources, but there's also kind of tension with William Pynchon as well, because you can't ever quite be your own independent man in your own independent household, because you're always to some extent in thrall to Pynchon. Now, the thing about this town as well is that although it has godly values, I think this is undoubtedly the case. They are a God-fearing community. They're not quite as God-fearing as some of the others. Some of the American plantations at this time, in fact, many of them in and around Boston, are transplanted Puritan congregations from England, separating from the English church and saying, well, we're going to go over there and live, much more according to our own Puritan beliefs and the Bible than would ever be possible in England. The Reformation is always unfinished business in England, and that these are people who've kind of finally had enough. And so off they go. But Springfield's not like that. William Pynchon found Springfield specifically not to be this, not primarily to be this godly covenanted community, but to make profit. He wants it to be industrious. He wants it to be independent, and he wants to make a lot of money from the trade in beaver fur, which is one of the reasons for moving to this part of the Connecticut Valley in the first place, so that he can get beaver skins from the Native Americans at the top of the Connecticut River.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And that crossover between the religious values and mercantilism, if you can call it that, where Pynchon has this desire for commercial success. He wants to. He's a trader. He's doing business. He's there for business. He has a very strong grip on the community, and like you say, that there's all of this opportunity that Springfield offers people in Old England, but it comes at a price. There's something interesting at the end of the book that you mention about this in relation to Thomas Hobbes, who wrote Leviathan around was it around the same period that
At the same time, it's 1651.
yeah, and you likened Springfield to a Hobbesian sort of setup. Tell us a little bit about that, because I think this idea of order and having somebody kind of look after you in a very paternal way, but it coming at a price. I actually think there's salience to this idea in relation to us as citizens now and the role of government. So tell us a little bit about that. How does this all work in terms of what is the Hobbesian idea in Leviathan, and how does it relate to Springfield?
Right. So, because what Hobbes was interested in was the way that, I mean, it's just to put it very simply, is interested in the idea of the growth of the state. And that really, if people are to have freedom and to live peaceably with one another, there has to be within the framework of the Leviathan, which is the state. Now, one of the questions that is uppermost in the minds of migrants to America, as it is to political thinkers in England in the middle of the 17th century, is what is liberty and how do you achieve it? Now, we tend to think of liberty being a much broader and more open kind of freedom than they thought. For them, liberty was a relationship that one had with one's social superiors and with the state defined more broadly. And so that what is, and this is something which has been developing or really hardening in English life for at least a century before, is the idea of a state built upon the law. It isn't just about the authority of a monarch. It isn't just about the authority even of Parliament, although the relationship between the two is extremely important. It's actually about the relationship between the people and government, and that government needs to be consensual to some extent, but it's also got to have majesty, and it's got to have hierarchy, and it's got to have the monopoly of violence, which is essential to that idea of the modern state. And without it, Hobbes said, you have the war of all men against all men, and that you just see little bits of this breaking out in Springfield, because witch hunts quite often take place, as took place in Salem, at moments of political uncertainty, where people actually aren't really sure what good government is, are not really sure whether the law is being applied, or even if the law is actually valid or legitimate. And so it's a wobble. And I think that you do see this in Springfield too. Pynchon he so embodies authority and the law in this rather remote location, that when Pynchon himself becomes a rather questionable character, mainly because of his religious beliefs and the way that his religious descent to the Puritan orthodoxy as is enshrined in Boston, that this actually starts to undermine patriarchy. And of course, patriarchy is essential to the Hobbesian Leviathan. Patriarchy is essential to the idea of the English state. And that really, that again, thinking about this moment of the late 1640s, early 1650s, is that Charles I is executed in 1649 largely because he's a failed patriarch. The patriarchy isn't a monolith. Patriarchy is a form of government. It's a relationship between the people and their superiors. It must be reciprocal. And Charles, by failing in this, marks himself out as a bad patriarch, and therefore he commits a kind of treason against the English people. And you see this all the way down to even quite humble households, including in Springfield, where Hugh Parsons falls pretty much at the same time as Charles I. Now they're 3,000 miles apart and very different men, but in some ways they've both failed at the same in the same expectation that had of men in authority. And in the same way that Charles I lets down the nation, Hugh Parsons lets down his household and his neighborhood, and is reviled in a really very similar way.
That brings us beautifully on to talking about gender, Malcolm, because gender seems to be a very, very big theme throughout the book. And questions that came to my mind when I was reading it is what does it mean to be a man and what does it mean to be a woman? So tell us a little bit more about that in terms of those sorts of expectations that were put on people like Hugh Parsons, who was a brick maker and very much necessary within Springfield. People had to go to him to get their bricks, and from what I ascertained from the story, it doesn't seem like a lot of them really want to deal with him, but they have to deal with him. But he seems like a man who's under a lot of pressure that's really bearing down on him because of all these expectations. So tell us a little bit about what those expectations were that were putting him under such pressure, and then maybe move on to talk about some of the pressure that women felt as well, that his wife, Mary Parsons, felt as well, please.
Right. So we've got to think about these neighborhoods as political units. So that back in England, for example, England is made up of 9,000 parishes, and that really makes up the whole of the state. And the relationship between those parishes and the centre of government through law really makes the English state work. So the English state isn't a thing as much, it is a set of relationships. And of course, this is actually true. This is transported to the English colonies in America as well. They have to have hierarchy, there has to be law, there has to be discipline, but there have to be social relationships. Now, the one of the ways in which these relationships work is through honor. Now, we've rather lost the 17th century meaning of honor, but what honor really is sort of coterminous with or synonymous with is reputation. And this is, you need to have a good reputation because this is what makes it possible for you to work with other people within this political unit of the community. And if you have a bad reputation, that makes life very difficult. So these are rather, especially in the colonies, these are rather vulnerable communities. They're economically vulnerable. Relationships can be rather strained because resources are quite often in short supply. So that makes it all the more important to have a good reputation and to have good relations. And that these relationships are gendered, they are structured the expectations are structured according to the way that men are supposed to behave and the way that women are supposed to behave. So men are supposed to be forthright and open and industrious and honest and respectable and the rest of it. It's sort of, we can imagine what that'd be like. Women, it's really rather similar, but they need to be more chaste and they need to be good mothers and they need to be good wives and so on. But the way that the household works is not through the exercise of harsh discipline of the husband towards the wife, but of some kind of symbiosis, some kind of cooperation, where patriarchy dictates that the man is ultimately in charge, but that the rule of the household should be by consent. And if it's not by consent, then actually there's something wrong with the man's authority. So that in a community like Springfield, the man that beats his wife, it's not illegal, but amongst his neighbors, he would consider to have failed because he can't exercise natural authority. And so this is one of the reasons why I think Hugh Parsons is accused of witchcraft, because it's seen that he can't assert the natural power of a man as a householder. That's what patriarchy is. It isn't just about being a man, it's about being a successful male householder. And the men work within groups within the community, and women have their own groups too. And that women are constantly monitoring, surveilling, and judging each other and gossiping and talking about each other. That's how the political life of the community works, by people watching and talking. Now, we would find this incredibly oppressive. we'd find this an appalling and unacceptable invasion of our own personal spaces. But this is much more acceptable in this society because this is how communities regulate themselves, as well as just being individuals who are regulated by the law, which was much more the way that you and I live today.
Yeah, that's very interesting. There's some quite interesting points to draw out from that in terms of that meaning of honor as well, and honor as being reputation, and that reputation being a form of currency. Because it seems as though if you fall foul of that and you are dishonorable or you have a bad reputation, then it's easy to become something of a social pariah, and you are being judged all the time. And like you say, it's very invasive as well. Judgments have been made, and there are consequences. I think in when I was reading the book, and I noted the number of altercations that Hugh Parsons has with his neighbours at various different times. It reads as though they just have to do business with him because he's the only guy they can get bricks from in that particular vicinity. But if they didn't have to if he didn't have this indispensable skill, then they'd just cut him off, and that would be the end of it.
I think that's absolutely right. And that Pynchon Hugh Parsons is, to that extent, a kind of mini-me version of William Pynchon. He's a man in the community that everybody depends on because, as you say, he can supply this unique thing. If you want corn, you could go to half a dozen men, or if you want a barrel made, you'd go to several different men. But if you want bricks, it's Hugh. And the fact that he's so objectionable means that there is bound to be conflict. But to be honest, even if he wasn't objectionable, I think there would be there's likely to have been tension, because if you are a dependent, then you are likely to feel some kind of conflicted feelings towards the person, towards your patron, feelings of gratitude, but also feelings of resentment that you can't be free of them. And I think that's a human feeling that we can all slightly identify with. I think anyone who's got teenage children would understand that quite often teenagers want to assert themselves in the world, but they still need lifts and things. And actually, that's a sort of there's not a totally flippant analogy because it's an ambiguity, isn't it? And that ambiguous relationships produce ambivalent feelings of gratitude, but also of a slight chafing at the fact that you can't entirely be your own person. And I think that's certainly what happens between the people of Springfield and Hugh Parsons, and also in the background, their feelings towards William Pynchon as well.
Yeah, very interesting. I love that parallel between Hugh Parsons and William Pynchon. I decided before coming on this call I didn't want to give too much information away about the books. I think if people haven't read it already, then they should absolutely go ahead and do so. But I'm interested as well, Malcolm, in what we're talking about in terms of the religious values of the town, of the place itself, because it's kind of assumed that there is this thing that we call, that is known as patriarchy. There is this thing in terms of the Puritan kind of setup, and the rules of the game are kind of laid out that people have to play by. What did that look like? What explicitly do we mean when we say patriarchy, and what were the sort of religious axioms or laws that people had to live by? Because I get the impression that they were much more strict and quite different from what we would be used to today. Like you said before about things being so invasive. So what were these modalities that people had to live by, and what do we mean by patriarchy in that context?
Well, one of the reasons for the Puritan migrations to America in the 1630s was to restore the charity between neighbors that these migrants felt had disappeared. That neighbors were at war with each other, and that neighbors disregarded each other, and they wouldn't lend things to each other. And there was just this kind of meanness, this cold-heartedness that had set into English life because of adverse economic circumstances, between the end of the 16th century and the early decades of the 17th century. Now, of course, the irony of this is that this rebuilding of Christian charity in America actually really only, what they found was that they ended up behaving in pretty much the same way. And I don't think that Christian charity ever really was restored. And actually, really, that these English migrants took themselves with them, and they found that as they rebuilt the English world, they're more of that their old ways, negative as well as positive, manifested themselves. But this doesn't mean to say that they threw away the idea of Christian charity. I think it just means that there was more unease and more guilt as they found that they were unable to live up to their own ideals. Because in Springfield, everybody knows that you're supposed to be charitable and Christian towards your neighbors. That's what's preached from the pulpit. This is absolutely standard. But in reality, people are envious and grasping and scheming, and looking with green-eyed envy at their neighbor's land and the rest of it, and resenting other people's success. And that this creates an internal conflict. So I think that their values are very clear, but they're mostly observed in the breach. And so patriarchy is something which I suppose I associate more with the politics of the household, and that maybe that Christian charity is something I would relate more to the neighborhood and to the community. But they are, of course, connected because the neighborhood is made up of households. But the internal workings of their household should be according to patriarchy, which, as I say, is not about oppressive control from the patriarch within the household. It's about having easy, natural authority that means you don't have to show this kind of coercive control. And that within the community, the idea is that neighbors should be tolerant of each other, and that they should work together, and they should be cooperative. And especially in a mid-17th century New England plantation, this is especially important because they are often cut off from other sources of, or they're remote from, not completely cut off, but remote from sources of assistance, which would be usual, say, if they still lived in their English villages, because you could ride to the next village and get something you needed or whatever, but often they have to kind of rely on each other because they are remote, but that's often difficult because they don't like each other. So that these people this is one of the ironies of this story, one of many ironies, that these migrants are stranded in this little world with lots of external dangers, the weather, disease, hostile Dutch, hostile Native Americans, wolves that prey on the sheep, insects that eat their crops, the rest of it. But actually, the thing that really bedevils them is one another. That's where the greatest risk lies. That's they can't quite rely on each other in the way that they know they should be able to. But they're all to blame.
Yeah.
But that it's just Hugh Parsons and Mary who seem to get, this is where a lot of these uneasy, conflicted feelings are concentrated on this couple, as if it's their witchcraft which is to blame for the misfortune of the town, rather than anything else.
Yeah, that's interesting that they become a scapegoat or a lightning rod for all of these other misfortunes and other people's sense of resentment and jealousy as well. I think you use a phrase, you identify this tension in the book between Christian obligation and thrusting ambition. And I think that's a very good way of putting it, because of course people might have these values and ideals that they purport are theirs and that define their community and are the rules that they live by. But like you say, people are still human, people still have these natural tendencies. And it's a case of, do they want to overcome those things? Do they want to move on from those things? Do they want to transcend those things, or are they going to kind of live this dual life, if you like?
Exactly.
But speaking of duality and deviance, if you could call it that, William Pynchon, talking about William Pynchon's case, Pynchon, like we've already said, it kind of has this almost omnipotent role within Springfield, but yet he isn't by any means omnipotent in the context of the church, is he? Because he falls foul of the authorities and is charged with heresy. So tell us a little bit about that. What is heresy? What does it really mean in this context? And what are the consequences for someone like Pynchon, who is in a very prominent position of power within the town?
Yeah, so it's very it's I mean I think it would be an interesting story without the heresy, but I do think there's something about William Pynchon being accused of heresy which undermines his authority and destabilizes Springfield at this time, and I think that makes witchcraft a witchcraft accusation more possible. The thing about the, and this is another irony of the story, that there are that going back to the start of the Protestant Reformation, that this is about opening up possibilities of interpretation of the Bible. So rather than just accepting unquestioningly the authority of the Pope from Rome, this is actually about allowing religion to be shaped by what the Bible says, and by seeking God's approval and God's guidance through prayer. They are the basics. But of course, this means that religion is subject to interpretation, and that the Bible can be interpreted lots of different ways. So this is why that so much of the history of the Long Reformation isn't about conflict between Protestants and Catholics. It's about the competing claims of different kinds of Protestant interpretation. So that those Puritans who go to America are quite often strict Calvinists. That's what we're really talking about. And they think that the Reformation in England is a soft thing, a fudge. It's quasi-Catholic. And it's getting worse under Charles I. And actually what they need to do is to go to their stricter Calvinist religion and build on that in America. Well, they do that, but that doesn't mean to say that they don't take with them people who still disagree on finer points of interpretation. So William Pynchon has his own particular ideas about Christ's sacrifice at the crucifixion. And Pynchon's idea is essentially that this was that there was wrath at the crucifixion, but it wasn't God's wrath. It was the wrath of the devil who made Christ resent the fact that his Father was allowing him to die, and that really the reason that Christ sacrificed himself was as a display of perfect obedience towards his Father. Well, this doesn't seem perhaps particularly controversial to us. It doesn't seem particularly important, but in the mid-17th century, this was a significant deviation from the ideas of the the Puritan hierarchy in Boston about really what Christ's sacrifice meant. That meant he was a heretic. Now, the heresy has ceased to be a capital crime. The last heretic is executed in England in 1612. There's no question that William Pynchon is going to be executed for his heresy, but banishment is he is required to recant this or get out and go back to England. And so it can't be permitted, because the thing here is that the religious orthodoxy and political obedience are very much tied together in post-Reformation states. These are what are sometimes referred to as confessional states. That means that there must be one religion and you must follow it. And if you don't, you are deviant from the law. Now, by the end of the 17th century in England and in America, there's much greater toleration, but it comes very slowly and it comes very painfully, because along the way, it feels like to allow the toleration of other religions, like Quakers, for example, who are prominent in late 17th century America as they are in England, to allow that feels to many traditionalists as if all order is being abandoned, all higher ambitions towards finally creating the perfect Protestant state have been abandoned too, and therefore are prone to accusations of, well, as they would have called it, atheism. It's like, oh, you've given up, you've chucked everything away, and now we're all going to hell in a handcart.
Right. Wow. There's quite a lot to that. And it seemed like the stakes on people having an opinion were very high on religious and doctrinal matters, and like you say about interpretations of the Bible, which does seem ironic, like you point out, because one of the thrusts of the Reformation was that people could have their own interpretations and their own readings of the Bible, their own access to the Bible, and that it wasn't just a pope or a religious leader who would pass those interpretations down onto the masses, so to speak. So some interesting tensions going on there as well, and certainly they're interesting to read about in the book, to dig into further. I would like to come back to witchcraft at the moment, Malcolm, because I think that there are some interesting things in the book, and there are, I think, at least 2 chapters, I would say, when I was reading the book and I was reading the accusations against Hugh Parsons, and notwithstanding the social dynamics and the milieu in which he was, I found it very interesting. Some of the chapters were pretty spooky. I think Strange Dreams and That Dumb Dog, I think, in particular, where there are these really bizarre accounts of things, of people being in trances and people having curses put on them, strange things happening, people falling off horses on familiar routes, and all of these things add up, and you kind of think to yourself, well, is there something more going on here? Or is this all mere coincidence, or is it people creating a theatre to expel or expose unwanted neighbours? I'm interested. This is a conversation we had in the past when we met in person in an entirely different context. But I'm interested in what you make of these sorts of accounts, because they're quite vivid, some of them. You know, snakes appearing to people in the middle of the night and saying things like death and goodness knows what else. How do you make sense of that yourself? Because one of the strengths of your book, I think, and this has been said in some of the reviews, I think in the TLS review in particular, it notes your compassionate way of writing, in that you take the primary source evidence at face value. You don't come in as if, you know, these were all silly, superstitious people and I am some enlightened, rational being that knows better than they are. You do take things at face value. So how do you make sense of these quite bizarre, sometimes quite alarming accounts that come forward? And some of them, particularly in the Hugh Parsons instance, it does seem like, wow, is all this really a coincidence? Is all this just some sort of fabrication or plot against him, or is there something more? So how do you make sense of all that?
Well, I think that in some ways my answer is kind of contained in your question. I make sense of it by describing it in a non-judgmental way. So I think that it's the easiest thing in the world with witchcraft narratives is, if we don't believe in witchcraft, and I'm assuming that most readers of this book don't believe that human beings can draw down the power of the devil to do good or harm. I'm making that assumption. Some will, but I think most won't. And I think it is, and of course, witchcraft is at the very least no longer a criminal offence. It hasn't been for a very long time. So to that extent, we do live in a world without that kind of witchcraft. It has passed out of our culture and consciousness to that extent. The easiest thing in the world is to say, well, what was really happening? There's been loads of histories of witchcraft about this. What were they really suffering? They weren't suffering from witchcraft. Were they suffering from diphtheria? Was Mary Parsons, by seeing the devil, was she suffering from postpartum psychosis and so on? Well, they don't use these terms. And I think that, the main purpose of my writing, specifically in this book, is to try to recreate a world in which these things made sense, not for us to make sense of them, but to make sense of their world and then see what makes sense to them. Because if you do start intervening with present-centered explanations in a description of the past, I think you destroy that kind of illusion that you're trying to create as a writer. You shatter the integrity of the world that you've spent so long trying to build up, because this is something which I think a lot of people have inherited from the Enlightenment, is the idea that pre-modern people were somehow a bit dim, or they're a bit ignorant, or they're just prejudiced, or they live their lives according to fear rather than reason, and the rest of it. And there's a little bit of that I think that we couldn't quibble about, but that these are intelligent people, and they're often very unsure of what they think. They're not obsessed with witches, and that when it comes to accusing or blaming specific misfortunes on witchcraft, they're often very unsure of themselves. What happens in Springfield, and what happens in other places where witchcraft accusations get off the ground, is that patterns form in people's minds, and we can all, human beings, still do this. We still do it all the time. We perfectly possible for us to add, one and one and one and make four. We just come up with a different answer because our brains have evolved to make patterns between things, because sometimes we'll be right. And that if you add, this is so important for this book and so important for understanding the history of witchcraft, if you add the ingredient of emotion, very high emotion, often toxic emotion, emotions of particularly fear and anxiety and anger and even rage towards specific individuals and groups. Once you put that into it, then I think it's much more possible to create what we might call conspiracy theories, which of course is still something which blights our times, perhaps more so than it has for an awful long time. And so I think this is what happens. So I think it's you used the word coincidence. I think they are coincidences, but they're in the very literal sense of they're things that occur at the same time, but that meaning is drawn from them by people at this particular moment. Other people, as we discover in the story, when these stories of witchcraft are transferred from Springfield to Boston, they don't mean the same thing anymore, because these are people looking at this in the cold light of day there, and without the emotion, which is so important at Springfield, then actually 1 + 1 + 1 adds up to 3 after all, and it doesn't actually mean quite the same thing. So I think that, but in writing about it, it is just extremely important to try and explain witchcraft, but not explain it away. This is something I always say to people when they ask, because if you say, oh, well, actually, they were all suffering, as people sometimes say about the Salem witch trials in the 1690s, that people were suffering from ergot poisoning, ergot being a fungus that grows on damp rye stores. You just explain it away. This isn't necessarily a good explanation, because what we need to confront when we look at these stories is the power of belief, the power of people to sincerely believe that something is happening, because actually in that world, it's not necessarily inevitable, but it's certainly plausible that could be the reason, and that the reason, there are 10,000 cows die in the early modern world for every one that's blamed on witchcraft. But that's because in most cases, people have a very modern, natural sense of blaming, of understanding misfortune as just being a natural thing, or maybe blaming it on God. But in that 1 in the 10,000 case where it's blamed on witchcraft, it's because lots of different things have come together. Lots of feelings and relationships and instances have come together, often over quite a long period of time, to make that truth in inverted commas seem very real in their minds at that time. And that's why I would prefer to think about these accusations in the first instance as being sincere, rather than just treating them as being prejudicial or some other kind of delusion.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I remember years ago when we spoke previously, you mentioned that when you were teaching at UEA, you mentioned that all of the, if I recall correctly, that all of the history students who were coming in the first year had to do a module on witchcraft.
That's right.
Because,
they still do.
Yeah, and because you wanted them to get to grips with reading and studying history at university level. And as I recall, it was that you didn't want them to have this linear sense of history where there are these absolute right answers to things, and that they just need to learn what the answers were and what happened at this date and place at this time and who did it, and then regurgitate it in the exam. It was more about learning how to think and how to assess and how to analyze, gather evidence, and basically interpret that evidence and present it in a new form. And it's always stuck with me as that, especially in relation to the value of primary sources, because I think it's really, really important that we are able to take the past on its own terms, not to explain it away, but to understand the world in which people lived in the past, and perhaps why they made the decisions that they did. That leads me on to another question, Malcolm, just in coming towards the end of this. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I almost feel as though there's a moral or maybe morals to your story. Is that the case? And if so, what is the moral of the story?
Well, that's a difficult question, but it's an important one. And I think that historians don't, or perhaps shouldn't, write in a way that is intended to have a moral. I'm not a, I think, the morals in this way, or moralism, implies some kind of judgment, I think. And I think historians really shouldn't judge. I mean, as you were just saying about, taking the past on its own terms, that's about historians not being judges, but being, not, in some ways, not always taking sides. Now, I know obviously there are limits to this, to some of the more, amoral, bestial acts in human history, which one can't sit on the fence about. But I think when you're trying to understand a mental, psychological world in the past, that it's very important not to be judgmental. So I think that if there is a moral to be drawn from it, not necessarily one that I intended, but one that I imagine that readers might take from the book, is actually really rather close to some of the morals which 17th century people tried to impress upon one another, which is that this is what happened. Some of these, these excesses of persecution and of alienation and of ostracism take place when people stop looking after each other, and people stop showing understanding and kindness and toleration of those around them. And of course, these are still problems very much for our own world, at the national level, the international level, right down to the level of individual communities, where people might feel very suspicious towards people who are different, or people coming into the community. So it seems like rather a kind of banal moral to draw from this, that actually we need to, we need to try to be kind and understanding. But it's as important as it ever was, and it really is a failing of those things that leads to the prosecutions of witchcraft in Springfield.
Yeah, wow, I love that. I really like that answer, Malcolm, and particularly what you're saying about the historian's job not to be a judge. It's not the historian's job to be a judge. It's the historian's job to make sense of things, and to help people to understand things as they were, as best they can. But I think you're right in the sense that the readers can infer morals to the story, and I think that's their job, and that's very much, like you say, that's very much an eye of the beholder sort of thing. And to some people, the morals of the story will be self-evident to them because of the values that they have in their lives, and what guides them, like you've just said about the need to be kind to each other. And ironically, that is within the scripture that those people were living by, in the sermons that they were hearing were coming from scriptures that talk about loving your neighbor and things like that. So very interesting to reflect on that, very interesting to think about what values actually mean, not just in terms of word, but also in terms of practice. And that's quite, again, it's quite ironic that Christ in the New Testament, the words of Christ are on the lines of, be ye doers of the word and not hearers only. And so maybe that was a sermon that was missing in Springfield to some extent. But
I think they probably knew it. They
yeah,
knew it. But of course, it's if you're aware of these things, but you can't live up to it, that's where you
yeah,
really get the conflicted feelings. And I think
yeah,
that's what it's not the presence of too much good or too much bad in Springfield. It's the conflict between the two that really makes
yes.
it so explosive.
Yeah, absolutely. And seeing that play out on a societal level, never mind what's going on in people's individual hearts, minds, and souls, but seeing that on a societal level is really quite interesting, and quite interesting to think that there was this intention to create some sort of spiritual oasis or El Dorado, and have it be kind of pure, if you want to use that terminology. Very,
Oh, I think those Puritans are they're utopian in so
yeah,
many ways. They really do believe that actually, and that those early migrants think we need to set a beacon for old England, and we will make it perfect, and then they will follow us. But of course, what happens is that they don't manage to do it either, because actually, in the end, they're not supermen; they're humans.
yeah, absolutely. Malcolm, thank you so much for your time. I've got to ask before you depart, what's next? What's next after this latest book?
I'm working on escaped prisoners of war and
Okay,
partisans in wartime Italy. So
brilliant.
very different, but similar in some ways, because it's actually, as anybody who reads The Rune of All Witches knows, that in the epilogue I really show how one starts to try to understand these stories as a historian from the present, and this is going to be the whole of this book, about trying to uncover one particular story from the war. So different in some ways, but actually at its heart it's a continuation of what I've always done.
Very good. Well, we'll certainly look forward to that. And Malcolm, just to reiterate, your latest book, The Ruin of All Witches, Life and Death in the New World, it's available at all good bookshops in the UK, Waterstones, no doubt. It's been published in the United States as well, so it's available there.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, super. And of course on the ubiquitous Amazon as well. So Malcolm, thank you so much for your time on the Real Clear Values podcast.
Thank you for having me on, Tom. It's been great.